Turn 2 is basically just more maneuver. We see the first line is close, not quite on top of, but getting real close to the Gaussian villages there. The screen to the left of this road is underway. Far in front are the reserve cavalry. See, they've become strung out. They'll actually be out of command the next turn, most of them. A little closer we have the center, or the left wing reserve, no, the center wing of the reserve line, the artillery. They've just sort of followed and regrouped to their leader there. We did manage to activate the reserve line, so he will be able to move a wing when he gets someone in command. Right now they're all pretty spread out. Still use 2 command points to move the second line forward. Still not close enough to actually gain any contact with the French up there. Otherwise we had some regroups going on, just sort of dragged units forward. See, they're going to take on this funny little U shape because when they get close to their leader, they have to stop moving as soon as they become back in command. So they sort of huddle around him. We see that repeated. Then we had further leader movement that actually allowed these guys to move forward again, so next turn we would drag them when they regroup back up to their leader. The French did manage 1 maneuver unit. The light cavalry leader gained initiative, so they moved towards the stream. They're going to try to get across here, but probably going to be too late to be of any real use. Looking at the advance of the Allied army in the first line. But otherwise, they largely stayed in position, except for the regroup actions that slowly dragged the 11th and the 9th divisions forward. Now the cavalry here made it pretty important for the French general to fall back to his division, but the 11th is still far enough away that he actually is going to remain isolated out there and waiting for his men to catch up. No real movement here. The 10th division is just going to remain in position. And just one thing that I noticed, it was kind of a strange side effect I hadn't considered before, but since the Allies had their maneuver unit, exchanged offensive and defensive fire, actually had a French unit here, light infantry in skirmish order, fired upon, they took a casualty, failed their morale check, and retreated. Well, since they did not have a maneuver unit coming their way, they actually won't get a chance to rally these guys this turn. So I can see how that could happen many turns in a row in this particular game, given that the chances of having a maneuver unit are fairly low. That's just an added wrinkle to how difficult it'll be to keep the French together in fighting in the early stages of this game without any maneuver units. So heading into the third turn, I think we'll see what we can of the reserve cavalry sort of leapfrog up into here, trying to get in front of the French and keep this gap open. It's going to be very hard to move any of the reserve infantry forward just from the strung out nature of the command lines here. The French likely just aren't going to do anything except sit there and take their beatings. And the second line of the Allies is likely to occupy 2 more command points to try to get them moving and attacking over here in the west. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of a slow slog to get the engagement started. Well, huge parts of both armies are out of command. I don't think there are enough out of command counters printed to show it, but It's more interesting how I'm going to spend my ally command points this turn, I think. I'm going to spend 2 here, and then I'm going to spend 1 on the first line, and then 1 up here on the reserve cavalry. That means I'm going to leave my second line, which I'd been advancing in the west, alone over there. Basically all they'll be able to do is regroup up towards the leaders that are out in front of them. Now the French did not roll for an initiative, so they have no maneuver units, and the only movement they can do is regroup and leaders. So we'll go ahead and start drawing chits. So, not surprisingly, we draw the allied chit. So we'll just jump right into moving those guys. Let's have a little fun. Let's charge some cavalry here. I've got 1 squadron and 2 squadrons of dragoons there. So we're going to kind of throw them at the French right here. Got that disordered battalion, and we have that artillery. So I think we're just going to try to run those guys down. So I might be playing this wrong, but I believe the artillery are allowed to pivot to meet that charge, and now they have to try to stand before the charge. So we roll the dice, and the artillery stands. So we will be able to melee them. Let's see, I want to get 3 hexes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now these disordered units have no choice but to try to stand. They have pretty poor morale. I rolled a 44. They have a 31. So they're going to just stand, which means we'll have another melee upcoming, or at least some defensive fire and probably some melee. I think that'll be the only cavalry I'm going to charge. Just a demonstration, right? I'm not trying to win the battle. So now we would proceed to the defensive fire phase. So this disordered infantry would give fire. And they miss. Now we have these guns, which unfortunately are in fine shape. 16 on 1 modifier. Could we have had worse luck? We rolled a 12. So that's going to be a clean miss. So the artillery does not protect itself very well. Now we just determine melee strengths and the odds, which will be a 14 against a 4. And actually we did charge in a straight line, which should make this an easy 5-to-1 attack. And that will cause a disorder, which kills the guns. Now the leader can retreat to a safe distance. So we'll occupy that hex, mark these guys as exhausted, and we have a little cavalry charge. Now we'll repeat here, 28, so that'll be a 46 total. And that'll be 7/8, or let's see, yeah, 7/8 of 16 divided by 2, since they're disordered. So that'll be another 5-to-1 attack. And we roll a 44, which is a rout. So they will retreat getting out of the way of that cavalry, losing a increment of strength, and then we'll mark these cavalry as exhausted. So that will be it for our charges. Now we can move on to our time maneuver. So I push the first line up towards the Gorschen. Now I did cheat a little. I moved Klukes back to the windmill because I thought, oh yeah, that's command. I need to keep him in range of units for command and in range of Blucher there. Now, Blucher has moved out of range of the army leader, but I think we can get the army leader back up in position to keep him activated. I shifted these two reserve units, the artillery and that heavy cavalry, moved them up as far as I could. But the strange thing, I think, is when I maneuvered this center cavalry here. I mean, I'm just running them up the gap here because I know there can be no response. The French cannot engage them. They're not going to be able to maneuver. If I don't charge them, they're not going to be able to shoot at me. They're not going to be able to unlimber the artillery. It's a strange kind of situation, but that's what it means not to have maneuver, not to have command points. Get yourself into some trouble. So I sort of, inadvisedly tried to move these guys up, and they weren't able to get into position to actually help. They've really only left themselves pretty exposed. So we have defensive fire now. We have this French battalion that probably can manage some fire against those two Prussians, or one of those Prussians anyway, but it's probably not going to be very effective. We'll roll the dice, and it's suitably small, so no hits there. And we'll throw some fire from these skirmishers here. And that's also suitably low, so we're not going to have any hits there either. I think those are our only defensive fires. And for offensive fire, we can basically fire at that skirmisher with our Silesian Schützen companies. Probably aren't going to do any damage, but on the off chance, we'll throw some dice, and as I say that, of course, I threw a good die. Threw a 61 against those skirmishers. So that is just a casualty. And of course, our morale dice were 22, so they will disorder and retreat. Now, I feel like when you're in two hexes like that and you're going to retreat, you have to collapse onto the hex right behind you. So I don't know if that's just me or if that's really how it should be done, but I'm going to do it that way, which causes a stacking violation of morale check right there. But fortunately for the French, they rolled a nice high number, so they survive. Now we have these two battalions firing on this battalion in the church. Church will have a pretty good defensive factor. We're unlikely to get a hit on him, and we did not. So I think that's going to be it for our offensive fire. We don't have any artillery deployed, so that'll do it. Now for assaults, I don't know if I can assault an ammunition wagon, but even when I can, I don't care to. It's not worth it for this demonstration. But the church here, it's a pretty stout position. I don't think I want to throw these two battalions at it when the battalion is in defense, is in good order and full strength. So I'm not going to conduct any assaults. I don't have any morale or poor order units to recover or cavalry readiness to recover, so that'll do it for this this chit. This maneuver action is now done. Return to the draw cup. We're just going to have action chits remaining. So we have reinforcements. We know there aren't any arriving this turn, so that chit's discarded. Artillery, we don't have any special artillery to fire, so we're going to discard that one. Now we have the leader. We could go ahead and shift some leaders around. I dragged a few leaders around so I could take advantage of that regroup chit that's still going to come. But otherwise, I'm going to have the army commander in proximity to keep activated both the first line and the reserve line. Of course, the only chit left in the cup was regroup, so I'm just going to go ahead and regroup and then take stock of where they are. So we drag the 11th Division forward again. The leader is still dangerously exposed. I would expect him to be captured. But fortunately for him, the end of turn is coming. Otherwise, the French didn't move at all. But the Allies did regroup and drag a lot of forces forward on the reserve line here. And also on the second line a little bit. The whole right wing dragged itself forward, as well as this is Steinmetz Brigade there. So a little bit of regroup brought the Allied army forward. Otherwise, not much else happened. So with that being our last chit, that will be the end of the maneuver phase. We'll just go to turn adjustment, which is the end of this turn. So we managed to complete 3 turns just as before. Much of our efforts were spent on the command and maneuver phases, which I think could be expected. Early in this game, it's all about maneuver and getting in position. The French were only able to muster 1 command point in the 3 turns. Otherwise, they were kind of locked in place, unable to move effectively, and their only option was that kind of awful technique of moving a leader out in front of his troops and then having them run after him. So they weren't able to defend themselves very effectively. I think it shows right here in the Gaussians. We have the Allied first line really swept by and caused some damage. But then if we think about the Allies, even with 4 command points, they still weren't able to maneuver quite as well as maybe I might have expected. I think that's reflected in the sort of crazy command structure they have with the lines and lines broken down in the wings, and the only or the largest formation that can maneuver being a wing. That meant we had to activate our lines in order to get a wing to move. And I really only did that effectively with the first line here because that was part of the setup. The Army commander was started with Blucher and got the first line activated, and therefore they were able to move. I never did get really anything more out of the reserve line. Got them activated, but they never kept their command structure together so that I could move them effectively. So I was throwing my command points around, trying to get things moving, sort of waiting for the command structure to coalesce. Now there's some strange side effects, I think. Like I ran the cavalry up the center, just as I did in the first game. but they are moving with, impunity. They have absolutely no worries because there is no command available to the French to oppose them in any significant way. They can't even change formations, really. So as this cavalry moves up, they can take a position here and really stymie the French when the French finally do get some command at their disposal. That could backfire. It might be interesting to see that play out, because once the French get some command points, they're able to maneuver offensively, they could swallow up that cavalry and cut them off and make it really, really difficult for the Allies. But the basic gamble was that this reserve line would be able to move up and support the cavalry before the French could get any real command in place to oppose them. So largely we saw maneuver and a little bit of combat here around the Gortians. Not a lot of melees. The only thing I wanted to do was to throw this cavalry in there and run through a charge, because then we could see how the charge process concludes at the beginning of a maneuver segment, and let that play out before any of the other units move. So that's kind of a big advantage, big difference in the 5th edition. And it was kind of a bookend to the premier ability to move and melee for cavalry absent a charge. I just wanted to demonstrate those two things, make sure I saw how the different effects were. But there was one strange thing. I still haven't gotten my head around this one. And that's around the Gortians here, and we have this routed and disordered unit, and really specifically the routed plus Grand disorder. Because the French never had a command point, that meant, well, they had the one, but they didn't have a command point, so that means they didn't have an active turn. They didn't have a recovery phase, so they never had a route movement phase, so not only were they unable to rally anybody, but sort of strangely, these guys are just going to sit there and wait, who knows how long, until the next time the French get a command point. So it's a little odd. Sure, it means they're going to be, very vulnerable to an attack, but also it just sort of defeats one of the primary rules, I think, in the morale system, which is once a unit is plus Grand disorder, they have to route and keep routing away from the enemy. But just due to that little sort of anomaly in the mechanics, he actually won't be able to route till who knows when. And it goes without saying, I doubly hate the whole leader movement and regroup mechanism. Even though it's virtually all the French had at their disposal, I just think it's too clunky, too artificial. It's sort of a strange side effect. Certainly no one would have designed the system with that in mind. It just sort of happened. But it leads to this sort of strange looking formation that pops up when you're doing this, which is the little quarter moon. As units get close to a leader, but no closer, as soon as they get into command range, they have to stop. They sort of form an arc around the back of him, like this. And that will repeat itself as that little technique is used. Overall, I think we saw enough of the mechanics to sort of extrapolate how this would work in a larger setting, a longer setting, and maybe even a multiplayer setting. So I think we've seen enough to call this a fairly successful experiment. We have two kinds of play that we can compare against each other, and more or less call this completed.